There are places in West Texas where the earth refuses to rest, where the wind carries whispers that died 100 years ago, and the dust remembers every sin committed beneath the unforgiving sun. In 1891, the town of Redemption Flats was one such place. A scattered collection of weather-beaten structures clinging to existence in the vastness of the Chihuahuan Desert, where civilization had planted its flag but never quite taken root. It was the kind of town that existed in defiance of geography and good sense, sustained not by any natural advantage, but by the sheer stubbornness of men who refused to acknowledge that the land wanted no part of their presence. The town occupied a slight depression between low ridges of limestone and caliche, positioned there because an intermittent creek sometimes flowed after the rare rains, providing just enough water to justify the settlement. The buildings were constructed primarily of adobe and weathered planks hauled from Fort Stockton at considerable expense, their roofs a patchwork of tin and tar paper that baked in summer and leaked in winter. The main street, grandly called Commerce Avenue, though it was nothing more than packed dirt, ran east to west for perhaps 300 yards, lined with the essential establishments that marked any frontier community: a general store, a saloon called the Broken Spoke, a combination land office and post office, a blacksmith shop, a livery stable, and a boarding house that rented rooms by the night or week to men who had nowhere better to be. The population of Redemption Flats fluctuated with the seasons and the cattle markets. In spring and fall, when herds moved through on their way to the railheads, the town might swell to 300 souls or more, cowboys flush with trail wages, drovers looking for entertainment, merchants eager to separate both from their money. In the brutal summers and the surprisingly harsh winters, the population contracted to a core of perhaps 150 permanent residents, those with nowhere else to go or nothing else to lose. These were the shopkeepers and their families, the handful of craftsmen, the women who worked in the boarding house and the saloon, the Chinese laborers who did the washing and cooking that white men considered beneath them, the Mexican families who'd been there before the town and would likely remain after it was gone. It was a hard place that made hard people, a place where sentiment was a luxury few could afford, and questions about a man's past were considered poor manners at best and dangerous at worst. The law, such as it existed, was represented by a sheriff named Holland Kane, who served as much by consent as by election, his authority resting more on his willingness to shoot than on any particular dedication to justice. The town council consisted of the 5 wealthiest men in Redemption Flats, which was to say, the 5 men who'd managed to accumulate any wealth at all in a place where money flowed like water through sand, briefly present and quickly gone. At the eastern edge of town, where the last buildings surrendered to the desert scrub and the land began its slow rise toward the distant mountains, stood the cemetery. It occupied perhaps 2 acres of the least desirable real estate in an area where all real estate was undesirable, a low rise of ground that was nothing but rock and hardpan beneath a thin veneer of dust. The fence that marked its boundaries was a pathetic affair. mesquite posts that leaned at drunken angles, strung with wire so rusted it left orange stains on any hand foolish enough to touch it. The fence served no practical purpose. It was too low and too broken to keep anything in or out, but it provided a psychological boundary, a marker that said here the living gave way to the dead. Here the town ended and eternity began. The graves within the cemetery told the brief, brutal stories of redemption flats. Some were marked with proper headstones, carved granite or marble hauled from distant quarries at costs that must have represented months or years of savings. These belonged to the few who died with family money, or whose survivors felt compelled to mark their passing with something more permanent than wood. Most were simpler, wooden crosses that leaned and rotted in the weather, cairns of stones piled high enough to discourage scavengers, occasional iron markers that rusted but endured. A few were unmarked entirely, just mounds of earth that time and wind were slowly erasing, the occupants forgotten before their bodies had fully decomposed. The cemetery keeper was a man named Ezekiel Marsh, though most in Redemption Flats knew him simply as Zeke, or as that quiet fellow up at the boneyard. He was in his late 50s when our story begins, though he looked older. The frontier aged men quickly, grinding them down with sun and wind and the constant labor of survival. His face was creased deep with lines that mapped a life of outdoor work, his skin the color and texture of old leather, his hair gone mostly white beneath the battered felt hat he wore every day regardless of season. His eyes were gray, the color of winter clouds, and they held a peculiar quality that made people uncomfortable when he looked at them directly. Not hostile, not threatening, but distant somehow, as if he was seeing through them to something beyond, something they couldn't perceive. Zeke had arrived in Redemption Flats in the spring of 1878, appearing one morning driving a wagon loaded with his possessions, a spare set of clothes, a Bible he never read, tools for digging and carpentry, a bedroll, cooking equipment, and a trunk whose contents he never showed anyone and never discussed. He'd gone to the town council and inquired about work, any work, and they'd offered him the cemetery keeper position that had been vacant for the better part of a year since the previous keeper had left for California, with promises of gold that probably proved as empty as most such promises did. The position came with a shack, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but weatherproof after a fashion, located just inside the cemetery gates, and a stipend of $8 a month paid from town funds when those funds existed, which was perhaps 2 months out of 3. For this, Zeke was expected to dig graves as needed, maintain some semblance of order among the markers, and generally ensure that the dead remained buried and the cemetery didn't become an embarrassment to the town. Though what embarrassment looked like in a place like Redemption Flats was a question no one seemed able to answer. Zeke had accepted the terms without negotiation, moved into the shack that same day, and had been there ever since. That was 13 years ago now. 13 years of digging graves in ground so hard that every burial was an act of violence against the earth. 13 years of solitary living. 13 years of keeping company with the dead. He'd integrated himself into the community to the bare minimum extent necessary. He bought his supplies at Tobias Marsh's general store every Monday, attended the Methodist church irregularly, and sat in the back pew when he did, nodded to people he passed on the street, but rarely initiated conversation. He was present but not participating, there but not quite among them, a fixture of the town but not truly part of it. The people of Redemption Flats had long since stopped wondering about Zeke's past. In a place where half the men used names they hadn't been born with, and the other half had reasons for leaving wherever they'd come from, curiosity about history was a breach of the unspoken code that allowed the community to function. A man was what he showed himself to be in the present. What he'd been before didn't matter, shouldn't matter, was actively dangerous to inquire about. So Zeke remained mysterious not because anyone cared to maintain the mystery, but because no one cared enough to penetrate it. If they had asked, if the code had permitted such asking, Zeke might have told them that he'd been born in Missouri, that he'd fought in the war for the Union though he took no pride in it, that he'd done things during Reconstruction that had seemed necessary at the time but haunted him later, that he'd killed men and wasn't entirely certain all those killings had been justified, that he'd come west like so many others seeking not fortune but forgetting, hoping that distance and time and hard work might somehow absolve him of memories that wouldn't fade. He might have told them that the dead made better companions than the living, because the dead asked nothing of him, demanded no explanations, required no justifications, simply lay quiet in their boxes and beneath their stones, and troubled no one with their presence. But no one asked, so Zeke kept his own counsel and tended his graveyard, and the years accumulated like the dust that covered everything in Redemption Flats, obscuring details, wearing down sharp edges, making the past less distinct with each passing season. The work itself was hard but predictable. Deaths came regularly in a place like Redemption Flats. Men killed in accidents or gunfights, women dead in childbirth, children carried off by fever or flux, elderly people whose bodies simply gave out under the strain of frontier existence. Zeke would receive word from the undertaker, usually a man named Silas Cobb, who combined that profession with furniture making since both required skill with wood and nails, and he would dig the grave to specifications. 6 feet deep was the ideal, though in Redemption Flats' hard ground, that ideal was rarely achieved. 4 feet was more common, sometimes less if the earth was particularly uncooperative. He'd dig in the cool of morning during summer, work later in the day during winter, and when the hole was ready, he'd inform Cobb, who would arrange the burial. The burials themselves varied considerably. For the prosperous dead, the handful who died with money or family, there might be a proper service, a minister speaking words over the coffin, mourners gathered in their best clothes, hymns sung in wavering voices, for the poor, for the friendless, for the drifters and cowboys and prostitutes who died alone. There might be nothing more than Cobb and Zeke lowering the box into the ground. A few words spoken if anyone knew them, silence if no one did. Zeke had presided over both kinds and everything in between, and he performed his role with the same methodical care regardless, filling the graves, tamping the earth, positioning markers when there were markers to position, smoothing the mounds to neat geometric precision. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, Zeke would sit on the small porch of his shack and look out over his domain. He'd watch the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in colors that seemed impossible, purples and oranges and reds so vivid they looked painted, as if God was showing off his palette before putting the world to bed. He'd listen to the sounds of the town settling into night, the saloon piano beginning its nightly repertoire, dogs barking, the occasional gunshot that might mean trouble, or might mean someone shooting at coyotes, or might mean nothing at all. He'd smoke his pipe, a habit from his soldiering days, and think about the dead beneath his feet, all those lives reduced to boxes and bones, all those stories ended, all those hopes and fears and loves and hatreds finished and filed away in the earth's great archive. He'd become comfortable with death, even companionable with it in a way. He didn't fear it, didn't welcome it particularly, but accepted it as the natural terminus of all living, the one destination shared by rich and poor, good and evil, the successful and the failed. The dead in his cemetery were Democrats of a sort. They'd shed all their distinctions when they shed their lives, lying now in perfect equality beneath the indifferent sky. Presidents and paupers, heroes and villains, all reduced to the same thing, meat and bone slowly returning to the soil that had produced them. This was Zeke's philosophy, such as it was. He didn't articulate it, even to himself, but it informed his actions and gave him a kind of peace that most men in Redemption Flats never found. He'd made his accommodation with existence, had settled into a routine that provided purpose without demanding growth, that offered stability without requiring change. He was, in his way, content. Then came late July of 1891, and contentment ended. The stranger arrived on a Wednesday, brought in on the stage from Fort Stockton. He was unremarkable in appearance. Medium height, medium build, brown hair going gray, face weathered by sun and time, clothes that had seen hard use but weren't ragged. He gave his name as John Smith to the boarding house keeper, a claim that fooled no one but which was accepted with the same polite fiction that accepted all such claims. He paid for a week in advance, took a room on the second floor overlooking the street, and proceeded to spend his days drinking steadily in the Broken Spoke, and his nights gambling with whoever would sit at his table. He was not a good gambler. He lost more than he won, bet recklessly, seemed unconcerned with the steady depletion of his funds. He drank whiskey straight, in quantities that would have put most men under the table, but it seemed to affect him little, except to make him quieter, more withdrawn, as if he was trying to drown something in his gut that refused to drown. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in brief sentences that discouraged further conversation. Where are you from? East. Where are you headed? West. What brings you to Redemption Flats? Business that's finished now. The other gamblers tolerated him because his money was good and he lost it readily. The saloon girls tried their usual enticements but found no interest there. He'd wave them away politely, buy them drinks but decline their company, seemed to want only the whiskey and the cards and the noise that made thinking difficult. For 5 days this was his pattern. Rise late, eat little, drink much, gamble poorly, return to his room in the small hours, sleep briefly, repeat. On the 6th day, a Tuesday evening, he accused another player of cheating. The accusation came suddenly, after a hand where the stranger had lost particularly badly. He'd set down his cards, looked at the winner, a drover named Callahan, who had a reputation for rough play but not for dishonesty, and said in a flat voice, "You're marking the deck." The saloon went quiet. Accusations like that had only two outcomes in places like Redemption Flats, and neither involved walking away. Callahan had stared at the stranger, his face reddening, and said, "You calling me a cheat? I'm saying the cards are marked." The stranger had replied, still in that flat voice, as if he was commenting on the weather. "How they got that way, you can explain." What happened next happened quickly, as such things always did. Callahan stood, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. The stranger made no move to defend himself, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't stand or back away. He just sat there, looking at Callahan with something that might have been resignation or might have been relief. Callahan drew and fired 3 times, the reports shockingly loud in the enclosed space, and the stranger fell backward in his chair, blood blooming across his chest, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if seeing something there that no one else could see. He died on the saloon floor, drowning in his own blood, while the piano player continued playing because no one had told him to stop, and men stood around watching with the detached curiosity that frontier violence produced in those who witnessed it often. It took perhaps 3 minutes for him to die, 3 minutes of wet, gurgling breaths and spasmodic twitching, and then he was still, and someone finally thought to fetch the sheriff and the undertaker. Sheriff Kane ruled it self-defense after a cursory investigation that consisted primarily of confirming that Callahan had drawn second, which he had, even though the stranger had made no move toward a weapon. The law in Redemption Flats, such as it was, recognized a man's right to defend his honor, and an accusation of cheating was considered provocation sufficient to justify a shooting. Callahan was told to leave town for a few days until things settled, which he did, riding out the next morning with a clear conscience and no legal consequences. The stranger's possessions were inventoried: a spare shirt, a razor, a deck of worn playing cards, $17 in silver, and nothing else. No letters, no photographs, no documents that might reveal who he really was or where he'd really come from. The boarding house keeper claimed the room fee he was owed. The undertaker claimed the rest to cover the cost of a pine box and a plot in the cemetery, and the stranger was prepared for burial with no one the wiser about his true identity or his reasons for being in Redemption Flats. Silas Cobb, the undertaker, brought the box to the cemetery on the afternoon of July the 2nd, 1891. Zeke had dug the grave that morning in the southeast corner, the section reserved for those who died violently or without family, or with reputations that made their proximity to respectable corpses undesirable. He'd dug 4 feet down, fighting the caliche-laden earth every inch, and had the hole ready when Cobb arrived with the box in his wagon. Together they'd lowered the stranger into the ground, Cobb on one end of the pine box and Zeke on the other, ropes groaning under the weight. When the box settled at the bottom of the grave, they'd pulled the ropes free, and Cobb had looked at Zeke and said, "You want to say anything?" Zeke had considered, then quoted the only verse he could recall from the Bible his grandmother had read to him as a child. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." It seemed sufficient for a man with no name and no mourners. Cobb had nodded, climbed into his wagon, and driven back to town, leaving Zeke to fill the grave. The work had taken an hour in the afternoon heat. Zeke shoveled methodically, returning the excavated earth to the hole, watching it pile up over the box until the wood was no longer visible, until the stranger was sealed away from light and air, committed to the earth's keeping. When the hole was filled, Zeke had tamped the earth firm, shaped the mound to a smooth dome, and positioned the simple wooden marker that Cobb had provided, a plank with the words, "John Smith, died July 2nd, 1891. God have mercy," burned into the wood with a hot iron. Then Zeke had stood for a moment, looking at his work, experiencing the same mild satisfaction he always felt when a job was properly done. The stranger was buried. The earth had accepted him. The transaction was complete. Zeke had gathered his tools, returned to his shack, and given the matter no further thought. For 6 weeks, the grave had been unremarkable. Zeke passed it daily on his rounds, noted its gradual settling as the earth compressed under its own weight, saw nothing that distinguished it from the dozens of other graves in his care. It was just another mound of dirt, another marker bearing a false name, another forgotten man in a forgotten place. Then came August 19th, and everything changed. Zeke woke that morning as he always did, with the first light, his body conditioned by years of early rising to wake without need for a clock or alarm. He lay for a moment in his narrow bed, listening to the sounds of dawn, the birds beginning their morning songs, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wood as his shack adjusted to the change in temperature. Then he rose, dressed in his usual work clothes, made coffee on his small stove, and prepared for the day's routine. His morning inspection of the cemetery was a habit so ingrained it required no thought. He'd walk the rows, checking for damage from weather or animals, ensuring that no vandalism had occurred during the night, noting any maintenance that needed attention. The desert had scavengers, coyotes, foxes, the occasional mountain lion down from the hills, and sometimes they showed interest in recent burials, drawn by scents that human noses couldn't detect. Zeke had learned to recognize the signs of animal disturbance and to take preventive measures when necessary. On this particular morning, he'd walked his usual route, starting at the northwest corner where the oldest graves lay, moving methodically through the sections, his practiced eye scanning for anything out of order. He'd noted nothing unusual. The wooden crosses stood at their customary angles. The stone cairns remained intact. The few proper monuments showed no signs of damage or defacement. Everything was as it should be, as it always was, maintained in its careful stasis between decay and preservation. Then he reached the southeast corner, and his routine shattered like glass dropped on stone. The stranger's grave was open, not desecrated, not torn apart by scavengers, but open, excavated with a precision that spoke of human intelligence and deliberate effort. The earth that had covered the box had been removed and piled in 2 neat heaps on either side of the hole, exactly as Zeke himself would have piled it if he'd been digging. The excavation was rectangular, the walls straight, the bottom level. At the bottom, clearly visible in the morning light, sat the pine box, its lid still nailed shut, the wood showing no signs of damage or disturbance. Zeke stood at the edge of the open grave, his mind working through possibilities, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Someone had done this during the night. That much was obvious. But who and why and how without making noise that would have woken him? His shack was perhaps 50 yards from this spot, and he was a light sleeper, trained by years of military service and solitary living to wake at unusual sounds. He would have heard someone working with a shovel, would have heard the scrape of metal on stone, the grunt of effort, the inevitable small sounds that accompanied such labor. Yet he'd heard nothing. He'd slept through the night undisturbed, and woken to find this impossible thing waiting for him in the morning light. He examined the ground around the grave carefully, looking for evidence of the intruder, but there were no footprints in the dust, no disturbed vegetation, no tool marks on the surrounding earth. The only tracks were his own approaching steps, and the piles of excavated earth showed no sign of having been handled. No fingerprints in the dust, no shovel marks, nothing to indicate how they'd been moved. The cemetery gate was still locked. He checked it immediately, finding the padlock secure, the chain that held it intact. The fence, though poor, would make noise if someone climbed it. The rusted wire would squeal and ping under weight. Yet everything was quiet, undisturbed, exactly as he'd left it the previous evening. Zeke's first thought was vandals, though the thought didn't satisfy him. Vandalism in his experience was destructive. Broken markers, overturned stones, sometimes worse. But this was different. This was careful, methodical, almost respectful in its execution. The grave had been opened but not harmed, excavated but not violated. It looked, in fact, exactly as it had looked before Zeke had filled it 6 weeks earlier. His second thought was grave robbers, though that made even less sense. The stranger had been buried with nothing of value, no jewelry, no possessions, just the clothes he'd died in and the body they'd clothed. Even if robbers had somehow known he'd been buried with money, which he hadn't been, they would have opened the box to retrieve it. But the box remained sealed, the nails that held the lid in place undisturbed. Standing there in the growing heat of the August morning, Zeke felt the first stirrings of unease that would grow over the following days into genuine fear. Something was wrong here, wrong in a way that defied his experience and violated his understanding of how the world worked. But he was a practical man, trained by war and hardship to deal with what was, rather than worry about what might be. So he did what practical men do. He addressed the immediate problem and deferred the deeper questions for later consideration. He retrieved his shovel from the tool shed near his shack, returned to the grave, and spent the next hour filling it again. The work was harder than the original burial had been. The earth had dried in the intervening weeks, baked by the sun into something approaching concrete, and it resisted being moved. By the time he'd finished, his shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands were blistered despite their calluses, and the sun was high enough to make continued outdoor work dangerous. He tamped the earth down, reshaped the mound to its original configuration, repositioned the marker, and stepped back to examine his work. The grave looked as it should, as it had looked for the past 6 weeks, unremarkable and properly maintained. But Zeke found he couldn't look at it without feeling that something was watching him from beneath the surface. something that waited with patient malevolence for reasons he couldn't begin to guess. He said nothing to anyone about the incident. What would he say? That person or persons unknown had excavated a grave in the night without making noise, without leaving evidence, without apparent motive, and then departed without opening the coffin or taking anything. The sheriff would think him drunk or crazy, probably both. The townspeople would laugh, or worse, would start avoiding the cemetery out of superstitious fear, making his job harder. So Zeke kept his own counsel and resolved to pay closer attention in the nights ahead. That evening, he remained awake long after his usual bedtime, sitting on his porch, watching the cemetery through the gathering darkness. He watched until the moon rose, casting pale light across the graves, creating shadows that seemed to move in the corners of his vision. He watched until his eyes burned and his back ached from sitting, until the night sounds became monotonous and his thoughts began to blur with exhaustion. Nothing happened. The cemetery remained still, the graves undisturbed, the night progressing with the normal silence broken only by normal sounds. Eventually, sometime after midnight, Zeke's exhaustion overcame his vigilance, and he slept in his chair, his head nodding forward, his breathing slowing to the rhythm of deep slumber. He woke with the sun in his eyes and the certain knowledge, even before he looked, of what he would find. The grave was open again, excavated with the same precision, the earth piled with the same careful attention, the box exposed and untouched, identical to the previous morning in every detail, as if the past 24 hours, his labor, his vigilance, his attempts at understanding, had never occurred. Zeke stood at the edge of the grave, and for the first time in many years, felt something approaching terror. Not fear of physical danger. He'd faced that many times and knew its contours, but terror of the incomprehensible, of something that defied natural law, of a reality that refused to conform to his understanding of how things worked. He filled the grave again, working mechanically, his mind churning. When he'd finished, he walked to town to Tobias Marsh's general store, hoping that conversation might provide some clue, some explanation he'd missed. But his inquiry had yielded nothing useful. The stranger had been nobody, known to no one, remarkable only in death, and even that remarkable-ness was fading rapidly into the general indifference that attended most deaths in redemption flats. The next night, Zeke didn't even try to sleep. He positioned himself among the graves, behind a large stone monument, with a clear view of the stranger's grave. He sat through the entire night, eyes fixed on that dark mound, determined to witness whatever was causing this impossible recurrence. And witness it he did, though witnessing brought neither understanding nor comfort. Around 3 a.m, when exhaustion was clouding his vision and making his thoughts sluggish, the impossible happened in plain sight. The earth began to move, not torn or scattered, but moving with purpose and precision, excavating itself, piling itself neatly aside as if invisible hands were doing the work that hands should do. The process took perhaps 20 minutes, and when it was complete, the grave stood open again, the box exposed again, everything exactly as it had been the previous 2 mornings. Zeke had watched this happening, had seen it with his own eyes, and still couldn't quite believe it. His mind kept insisting there must be an explanation, some trick of perception, some natural phenomenon he didn't understand. but his eyes saw what they saw, and no amount of rational denial could change the reality of it. For the earth was moving itself, the grave was digging itself, and somewhere in the darkness something was demanding to be seen. Now Zeke understood, with a cold certainty that made his hands shake and his breath come short, that he was dealing with something far beyond his experience or understanding, something that existed outside the natural order he'd always trusted to make sense of the world, something that required witness, that needed to be seen, that wouldn't rest until someone watched and acknowledged what was happening. The stranger wasn't just buried here. Some part of him, some remnant of consciousness or will or desperate need, was still present, still active, still demanding attention from a world that had already forgotten him, and the earth itself had become complicit in this demand, serving as the stranger's agent, opening his grave night after night until someone finally looked, finally saw, finally provided the witness that was being demanded. Zeke had provided that witness now. He'd watched the impossible happen. He'd seen the earth move itself, and in doing so, he'd entered into some kind of compact whose terms he didn't understand and whose consequences he could only fear. In the nights and days that followed, the pattern continued with relentless consistency. Every night, the grave dug itself. Every morning, Zeke filled it, and with each cycle, his grip on rationality weakened. His understanding of the world became more uncertain. His fear grew deeper and more pervasive. He watched the process several more times, each viewing confirming what he already knew but still couldn't quite accept. The earth moved without agent, without tool, without visible cause. It excavated itself with patient precision, revealing the box below, exposing it to the night air and the pale moonlight. And from within the box, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of scratching, persistent, rhythmic, the sound of fingers against wood, of nails worn to bone, still trying to accomplish something that death should have made impossible. The watching was destroying him. Zeke lost weight rapidly, his face becoming gaunt, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. He slept in brief, nightmare-plagued intervals, waking with his heart racing and sweat covering his body. Despite the relative coolness of the nights, he ate little, his appetite killed by the constant knot of dread in his gut. He moved through his days mechanically, filling the grave each morning, going through the motions of his other duties, waiting with horrible anticipation for the night and the renewal of the cycle. The townspeople began to notice. Tobias Marsh commented on his appearance, suggesting he might be working too hard in the heat. The doctor, encountering him on the street, recommended rest and better nutrition. The Methodist minister invited him to services, suggesting that fellowship might ease whatever troubled his mind. But Zeke deflected these concerns with vague assurances, unwilling to speak the truth because the truth was unspeakable, because to voice it would be to invite ridicule or worse, to mark himself as mad in a place where madness had no safety net. On the 7th night of the cycle, August 27th, by Zeke's careful counting, he made his fateful decision. He would open the box. Whatever was inside, whatever had caused this disturbance, whatever was demanding witness with such persistent determination, he would face it directly. The not knowing had become unbearable, worse than any knowing could possibly be. His imagination had constructed horrors more terrible than reality could contain, and he needed those imaginings to end, needed to replace them with facts, however disturbing those facts might prove. He waited for the grave to dig itself, watching from his usual concealment behind the stone monument. The process occurred as it always did. The silence falling, the earth moving, the box being exposed. When it was complete and the ordinary sounds of night had resumed, Zeke emerged from hiding and approached the open grave. He'd brought a lantern and a crowbar, the lantern to see by, the crowbar to pry open the box. His hands were steady as he descended into the grave, steadier than they'd been in days, as if the decision to act had brought some measure of calm to his disordered thoughts. He stood beside the box in the narrow excavation, the walls of earth rising around him, and positioned the crowbar under the lid. The nails resisted at first, rusted and set firm by the hammer blows that had sealed them 6 weeks earlier. But Zeke was strong despite his recent weight loss, and desperation lent him additional strength. One by one, the nails gave way with sharp cracks that sounded shockingly loud in the night silence. When the last nail was free, Zeke set down the crowbar and placed his hands on the lid. He hesitated there, experiencing one final moment of doubt, one last opportunity to retreat from this course of action. But retreat was no longer possible. The decision was made, the nails were pried, and forward was the only direction remaining. He lifted the lid and looked inside. The body had decayed as bodies did in the dry Texas earth, not the rapid putrefaction of wetter climates, but a slow desiccation, a gradual mummification. The stranger's face was recognizable still, his features preserved enough to show the man he'd been. His eyes were sunken but closed, his skin drawn tight over bone, his hair gone brittle and gray. His hands were folded on his chest in the traditional funerary position, and he wore the same clothes he'd died in, now stained brown with old blood. But his fingers told a different story. The flesh was gone from them entirely, worn away to reveal bone that gleamed pale in the lantern light. The fingertips were ground down, smoothed by friction, shortened by weeks of persistent abrasion, and the underside of the lid showed the evidence of that abrasion. Deep gouges in the wood, scratches that had cut through the grain, splinters driven deep into what remained of the tendons and tissue. He'd been scratching, dead and buried. The stranger had been scratching at the lid of his coffin with a determination that had persisted beyond death, beyond the decay of flesh, beyond any reasonable expectation of what a corpse should or could do. But examining the angle of the scratches, noting the position of these ruined hands, Zeke realized something that made his blood run cold. The stranger hadn't been trying to get out. The scratches were on the inside of the lid, yes, but they were oriented wrong for that. They were positioned as if the stranger had been trying to hold the lid closed, to keep it sealed, to prevent something from escaping. He'd been scratching not in panic but in desperation, trying to maintain a barrier between what was in the box with him and the world outside. And whatever that something was, it had been waiting for someone to open the box, to break the seal that the stranger had died trying to maintain. As this realization struck Zeke, he felt it, a presence in the box with the corpse, a cold intelligence that had been trapped there for 6 weeks, compressed and contained by the stranger's desperate scratching and the nailed lid and the weight of earth above. It was formless but real, invisible but tangible, and it uncoiled like smoke or shadow rising from the box, flowing around Zeke in the confined space of the grave. The stranger's eyes opened. They shouldn't have been able to. The muscles that controlled eyelids had long since decayed, but they opened nonetheless. And they were wrong, utterly wrong, filled not with the clouded opacity of death, but with black, complete black, as if his eye sockets contained not eyes, but holes that opened onto infinite darkness. The corpse's mouth opened too, and a voice emerged, thin and dry like wind through dead leaves, but articulate, forming words that no dead tongue should be able to form. Thank you for watching. Thank you for seeing. Thank you for opening what should have stayed closed. There was gratitude in that voice, horrible gratitude, the gratitude of something that had been imprisoned and was now free, that had been contained and was now released, that had been waiting with infinite patience for exactly this moment, when curiosity and fear would overwhelm caution and provide it with exactly what it needed. Zeke scrambled backward, his boot heels slipping on the earthen floor of the grave, his hands scrabbling for purchase on the walls. He fell, crawled, found his footing, and hauled himself out of the excavation with strength born of absolute terror. Behind him, he heard sounds, the creak of wood, movement, something emerging from the box that should have remained sealed within it. He ran through the cemetery, past the rows of silent graves, through the broken gate that should have been locked, out into the desert beyond. He ran without direction, without thought, without purpose, beyond distance, beyond escape, beyond getting away from what he'd released. His lungs burned, his legs threatened to give out, his heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst, but still he ran, driven by a fear more primal than any he'd ever known. He ran until his body simply failed him, until his legs buckled and he collapsed in the dust miles from town, the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to his terror, unconcerned with his fate. Consciousness left him there in the desert, alone in the dark, and for a time that might have been mercy or might have been the prelude to something worse. He knew nothing more. He woke to daylight and voices, to rough hands shaking his shoulders, to the concerned faces of two cowboys who'd found him lying in the dirt. They'd thought him dead at first, or drunk, or sunstruck. When he began to regain consciousness, they'd helped him onto a horse, asked questions he couldn't answer, and ridden him back to Redemption Flats, where they delivered him to Dr. Morrison's office with the brief explanation that they'd found him out in the desert, unconscious and apparently in distress. Dr. Morrison, a capable if overworked frontier physician, examined Zeke thoroughly and diagnosed heat exhaustion, dehydration, and possible sunstroke. He prescribed rest, fluids, and removal from the sun, keeping Zeke in his office for observation. For 2 days, Zeke lay in that small room, drifting in and out of fevered sleep, unable or unwilling to speak coherently, his mind cycling through the same images again and again. The open box, the ruined fingers, those black eyes opening, that voice thanking him for providing exactly what it needed. On the 3rd day, his fever broke and clarity returned, though with it came the full weight of what he'd done. He'd opened the box. He'd released whatever had been contained there. He'd provided the witness that was demanded, and in doing so, had completed some dark transaction whose full implications he could only begin to grasp. Against Dr. Morrison's advice, he discharged himself and walked on unsteady legs back to the cemetery. He knew what he'd find there, knew it with certainty before he arrived, but needed to see it nonetheless, needed to confirm the reality of what had happened. The grave was filled, not by his hand. The earth had replaced itself with the same impossible precision it had previously used to remove itself. The mound was smooth, settled, looking exactly as it should look, as if nothing had disturbed it in the 6 weeks since the original burial. The marker stood straight, proclaiming the stranger's false name and the mercy of God. But the box was empty. Zeke knew this without digging, knew it with a bone-deep certainty that required no verification. Whatever had been in there with the stranger's corpse, whatever had used the dead man's eyes and voice, whatever had been demanding witness and waiting for release, it was gone now, free, uncontained, moving through the world pursuing purposes that Zeke couldn't imagine and didn't want to understand. In the weeks that followed, he heard things, stories that drifted through town in whispers and worried conversations. Cattle found dead in the pastures with no marks on them, their eyes open and black, as if all the light had been sucked out of them. People waking from nightmares they couldn't remember but which left them shaking and sick. A heaviness in the air, particularly at night, as if the darkness had gained weight, had become something more than the absence of light. Small things, easily dismissed individually, but taken together they suggested something had changed in Redemption Flats. Something had been added to the natural order of the town and the desert around it. Something that didn't belong but was now present nonetheless. And Zeke knew with terrible certainty that he was responsible, that his curiosity and his fear and his need to understand had opened a door that should have remained closed. He remained in his position as cemetery keeper because there was no reason to leave and every reason to stay. Where would he go? What would be different? The thing he'd released, it wasn't confined to Redemption Flats, couldn't be escaped by physical distance. It existed now in the world, and distance was meaningless against that reality. Better to remain, to continue his work, to maintain what order could be maintained among the dead, and to accept the weight of what he'd done. But he changed his practices. He never stayed in the cemetery after dark now, never watched the graves at night, never sought to understand when understanding came at too high a cost. He'd learned that some things were meant to remain unknown, that some mysteries served purposes beyond human comprehension, that witnessing could be dangerous, that observation could have consequences far beyond the simple act of seeing. The stranger's grave remained quiet after that. The cycle was complete. The witness had been provided. The release had occurred. The earth accepted its burden now without complaint, held it without resistance. Whatever had needed to escape had escaped, and what remained, just the stranger's decaying flesh and his ruined fingers and his empty eye sockets, lay properly dead now, troubling no one, demanding nothing, finally at rest in the way that death should provide rest but hadn't. Years passed, accumulating like the dust that covered everything. Zeke grew old, his hair going completely white, his face becoming more lined, his body slowly failing in the 1,000 small ways that bodies fail. He buried hundreds more in those years. The usual parade of deaths that attended frontier life, the violence and accident and disease, and simple wearing out that reduced people to boxes and bones and memories that faded with each passing season. None of their graves dug themselves. None demanded witness. They slept quietly, their dead properly dead, whatever they'd been in life fully finished now, committed to the earth's keeping without protest or disturbance. It seemed that what had happened with the stranger was unique, a singular occurrence that wouldn't be repeated, and Zeke allowed himself to believe this, to find some measure of peace in the normalcy that had returned. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the wind blew from certain directions and carried with it certain scents, dust and old death and something else, something indefinable but definitely there, Zeke would wake in his shack and hear scratching, not from the cemetery, from somewhere else, somewhere farther away, somewhere in the darkness beyond the town's meager lights. The scratching of something that moved through the night on business. Only it understood. Something that had been freed from its imprisonment and was now pursuing purposes that had been interrupted by death but were now resumed. On those nights, Zeke would lie awake until dawn, listening to that distant scratching, remembering the black eyes that had opened in the box, remembering the gratitude in that dry, dead voice, and wondering what he had released into the world, wondering if it had always been there, waiting in the stranger's corpse for someone to provide the witness it needed, wondering if such things existed in other boxes, in other graves, in other forgotten places where the dead weren't quite as dead as they should be. But he asked no questions, sought no answers, pursued no understanding. He'd learned that lesson thoroughly. Some knowledge came at too high a price, and he'd already paid more than he could afford. In the spring of 1903, Zeke died of pneumonia, his body finally surrendering after years of hard use and harder living. He died in his shack, alone as he'd lived, discovered 2 days later when he failed to appear for his weekly visit to the general store. They buried him in the cemetery he'd tended for 25 years, in a plot he'd selected long ago, as far from the stranger's grave as the boundaries allowed. His funeral was well attended by Redemption Flat standards, perhaps 50 people, which was a significant fraction of the town's remaining population. The minister spoke about duty and service, about the quiet dignity of honest work, about the peace that came from a life lived simply and without pretension. The mourners sang a hymn, out of tune but sincere, and then Zeke was lowered into the ground he'd broken so many times for so many others. The new cemetery keeper was a young man from Fort Stockton, energetic and efficient, full of modern ideas about cemetery management. He lasted 3 weeks before he quit without explanation, his face pale and his hands shaking, unwilling to say what he'd seen or heard, but adamant that he would not remain. The keeper after him lasted a month, the one after that 2 weeks. Eventually, the town stopped trying to hire someone. The cemetery became a collective responsibility, managed haphazardly by whoever could be convinced to dig when digging was needed. The graves grew wild, the fence collapsed entirely, the markers leaned and fell, and the desert slowly began its patient work of reclamation. By 1920, Redemption Flats itself was mostly abandoned. The population dwindled to perhaps 20 stubborn souls who refused to acknowledge that the town had died years earlier. The railroad spur had closed, the cattle trails had shifted to other routes, and there was no reason for anyone to be there anymore except inertia and age and the inability to start over somewhere else. In 1947, the last residents finally left, loading their possessions onto a truck and driving away toward Fort Stockton and whatever future might still be available to them. They left behind empty buildings and empty streets, and an empty cemetery where hundreds of forgotten people lay beneath forgotten markers and forgotten graves. But the desert remembers, the earth remembers, and on certain nights, when conditions are right, and the barriers between what is and what should not be grow thin, travelers on the old roads report strange things. Lights where no light should be, sounds of digging in the darkness, a sense of being watched by something that exists just beyond the range of vision. And if they're foolish enough to investigate, if they follow those sounds to the abandoned cemetery that was once Redemption Flats' formal acknowledgement of mortality, they sometimes find a grave that looks freshly opened, its earth moved aside, a rotted box exposed to the stars. Most have the sense to leave quickly, but some stay, some watch. Some provide the witness that's being demanded, completing the cycle that was started so long ago, releasing what should remain contained, opening what should stay closed. And then they leave, if they're able to leave, carrying with them the knowledge that some graves refuse to close, that some dead refuse to rest, that the act of watching can have consequences that echo far beyond the moment of observation. The earth is restless there still. The earth remembers. And in the darkness beneath that hard Texas ground, in boxes that should hold only bones, things wait. Patient things, hungry things, things that need only a watcher, a witness, a fool who thinks that seeing is harmless and understanding is possible. In 1891, in a forgotten town in West Texas, a grave dug itself every night until someone watched. And when that someone opened the box, when witness was provided and the cycle completed, something was released that had been waiting for longer than anyone knew. It walks still, they say. It searches still. It scratches still in the darkness, pursuing purposes that death interrupted, but did not end. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some graves were never meant to be opened. Some dead were never meant to be witnessed. But the desert keeps its secrets poorly, and the earth insists on revealing what it must reveal, and the act of watching, of seeing, of providing witness remains dangerous and consequential and impossible to take back once done. This is the story. This is the warning. This is the truth that came too late for Ezekiel Marsh and comes perhaps too late for you. Watch if you must. See if you cannot help yourself. But remember that some knowledge changes the knower, that some sight cannot be unseen, and that some graves, once observed in their opening, refuse forever after to remain properly closed. The desert waits, the dead wait, and the darkness beneath the earth is most patient of all.